Alright guys, welcome to Crypto Cafe, and this is my 10 graphics card mining tutorial. So first off, I want to say thank you to everyone who contributed to the absurd 2.3 million views I think it is on TikTok now. I don't know, I have nothing to say. So many questions that kept asking on how I did this, and what I'm going to be making today is essentially a 10 graphics card mining rig. I will be going over all the expenses and ROI, meaning return on investment. How long will this take you to actually pay itself off, and then how long will it take for pure profit to be rolling in, if that makes sense. Now, apology for a long introduction. This is my first video, so I don't want to just start it off like, hey, here's a video, but now we're going to be getting to the fun part, which is building the mining rig itself. So here we go. Now to go over all the parts you will need, everything will be linked in the description. Other than graphics cards, you're going to have to find out how to get those yourself, whether it's eBay, camping stores, Best Buy, doesn't matter, there is still ways to get cards. Now that we covered all the parts, I'm going to begin the process. First things first, I gotta build the cage. So the cage itself is going to look like this. This is a smaller 8-card cage that I will not be using for this setup, but at the end of the day, this is what it's going to look like. I don't want to bore you guys building the cage. The instructions will come with the cage when you buy one. It's very simple, just make it look like this essentially. Semi-built. I'm just missing the little top bar up here because I want easy access for now. We're going to be building the motherboard and installing it. So you guys know you could essentially use any motherboard processor combo. It could be an old processor, doesn't have to be good. This doesn't use essentially any processing power at all. You just want to make sure it has graphics card slots. It doesn't matter which size it is. It could be the small or large one. I'm personally not even going to be using this large one. I'm going to be filling up all the small ones because this fits 13, including the large one, and I will only have up to 12. So I'm just gonna, for clean sake, use all of the 12 slots here. Okay, so now that we built the cage, put in the little risers, which are the little gold things that come included with the cage. They hold your motherboard. We're going to actually be putting the motherboard in. So you line up the risers with the little holes in the motherboard, and then you place it exactly down on those little holes, and that will keep your motherboard secured. Is nice and secure inside the cage. We're going to be adding the processor. We're going to be using a i5 7400 only because it's the LGA 1151 socket, which will fit the motherboard I'm using. This differs from motherboard to motherboard, so make sure you do your research on that. So this is the processor. If you've never done this before and you've never built a computer, you basically lift this little piece out, you leave the black piece in, and then you're going to take your processor out of its box. Be very fragile with it because it is your processor. And basically there is two little grooves in the processor on the sides. You're going to line those up with the grooves here, which are basically, I mean, I've done this too many times, but make sure you find those little grooves and then put this down. And as soon as you click this down, that little black piece will fall out. You will hear sounds the way you just heard. Ignore that, that is 100% normal. Alright, so next we're going to be installing the cooler for the processor. Whether you use the stock one or the aftermarket ones, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to be using the cheap old stock one because it doesn't matter. And all you gotta do is line this guy up onto your motherboard and just click it down. Now after it's secure, take the little CPU fan port and go ahead and plug it down right next to your top end of the motherboard right here. It will be marked CPU fan. Okay, so next we will be going over the storage device. I'm going to just be using a cheap old SSD. but you can use a flash drive with HiveOs on it. If you don't know what HiveOs is, I will be definitely going over that in a future video. If you want to just use Windows and take any drive, whether it's a hard drive or a SSD, and have Windows on it, go ahead and use that. Or if you want to look up HiveOs and do that, I will have a link in the description on what HiveOs is and how to download HiveOs onto an SSD like I did. So now we'll be installing the SSD. I personally like to find little holes on the side like right here and then line that nicely up and install the SSD there. That way you could plug in your cables. Just make sure, I just almost did it wrong. There's a little bit of a bigger end on this. Use that side as the top so it's easier to get your cables in right down there. Okay, so now that your SSD is in, your motherboard is in, and everything I did before is built correctly, you're going to want to be installing your power supplies. Now, I'm going to be using multiple depending on how many GPUs you have, but your best rule of thumb is that a high-end graphics card like a 3070, 3080 will use approximately 200 to 250. I'm going to ballpark 250 to be on the safe side. Therefore, if you're going to be powering the motherboard on top of everything as well, you want to use a higher wattage. So I'm going to be powering 3 GPUs plus the motherboard on a 1050. And then for every 3 GPUs, I'm going to have an 850 like I do back here. But you want to make sure that you have a bigger one for the one that will be plugging into the motherboard directly. So you're going to want to take your power supply and line it up in the back so your ports are facing the same way as your motherboard ports are, and then you're going to be just basically screwing it down. So power supply 1 is in. Now what we're going to be doing, let me loosen my tripod, is installing one on this side because we are going to be using a lot more power, and then more than likely we're going to have to be also using some externally which will not be hooked up to this. Now before we get to the fun part of adding in all of the graphics cards up here and all of the fans making this look complete, we're going to have to power all of this. So the first step is basically powering everything with all the cables included with the power supplies, and then after we're going to be adding in all the fans. That just makes it a lot easier because if you put in the graphics cards first, it's going to be impossible to navigate this entire device. So first things first, we're going to be powering the main portion of it, which is the power supply to the motherboard. It uses the giant 24-pin connector, which you will plug in one end to the motherboard and one end to the power supply. It all should be marked on the power supply itself to what coordinates to what. So it's always rough plugging these things in. But here goes that. And then next, we're going to be plugging in the large portion directly to the motherboard 24 pin and clicking that down nice and tight. Next we will be powering the CPU, the processor itself. So you're going to take the CPU cable, it is marked on my end, CPU on the end of the cable, and we're going to plug it in to where it is marked CPU down here on our larger 1050 watt power supply. Alright, so next we're going to be plugging in the SSD to the motherboard and power. First we're going to need to power it by using the little cable included in the box of the power supply. And then the other end will go into the peripheral section of the power supply itself. That's good. Next, for the memory portion, we need to plug in a SATA cable directly into the SSD. And the other end of the SATA will plug into one of these guys down there, which is nice because it's right under where our SSD is. Sometimes it's on the motherboard directly. That differs from motherboard to motherboard. Just plug that in and you're good to go. So now we're almost done. We do have one more step. You can ignore this step if you are using one power supply, but the one to the left there is powered. This one is not hooked up to anything yet. It's just sitting in this cage. So what you need is a little adapter that looks like this. Let me just get the camera to focus. And it's going to use the same connection that plugs into your SSD up here, and the other end will be the motherboard plug that will plug into here. What this is going to do is going to trigger this to turn on when you turn on the computer. Plus, if you plan on using 2, 3, 4 power supplies, basically for every additional power supply you need one of these little guys. So now what I'm doing is plugging in the second motherboard, sorry, that's pretty hard to click in sometimes, the second motherboard cable to this power supply. And as I mentioned, I can't plug it into the motherboard because we already have that slot used. So we're going to plug it into this little device that I just explained, like so. And the other end will plug into the same cable that plugged into the SSD. There will be 3 to 4 more ports off that same cable. And lastly, we're going to be plugging in all the PCI Express cables into the power supplies themselves, 3 in each one, because I will be powering 3 graphics card per power supply. So 3, 3, and then I'm going to need to bring in 2 more power supplies externally back here to power the remainder. Alright, so now that all the cables are in here and in here, they're just kind of hanging down here. I'm gonna get all the fans in at the back, and then we're ready to start. We're gonna start putting in all the graphics cards along with risers. So the way it works is that little metal bar I have to still install will go here. On top of this bar will be the riser. We're going to have to plug in one end of the riser to the motherboard connector here, and the other one will basically be a power supply connection to power it, and it will just be nicely sitting while the graphics card will be mounted up here. So you'll see how this is all done shortly. Now that all the fans are in, we're going to have to connect them, but there's no way they're all going to fit on a motherboard, so we're going to use these Molex connectors that came with the fans. All you're going to have to do is take a peripheral Molex connector that comes with the power supply and connect that into it, and then the other end will plug into the adapters, and that will allow you to run a wire into the back of the rig and connect all the fans safely without having to worry that you will not have enough room. So our fans are on. I just installed the bar as well. The fans are plugged into the little cables I mentioned. All we have to do is put this little sticky part on top of the bar. This is included in the cage, and it just kind of lets it sit a little bit safer. So you just want to line that up and stick it down. And we are ready for the fun part, being the graphics cards. Before we put in the graphics cards, we need to add the risers for the graphics card to sit on them. So basically these guys sit up here, but you do have to plug them in, of course. So they come with the cables. So you're going to take the end with the PCI Express slot. I'm going to use my very first slot for the very first card, all the way in the very back left, and then run the cable into the riser, plug it in, and the other end you will take the graphics card port, the PCI Express, and plug it in here to power it. Now, because I'm going to be using so many cards, I'm going to be using little adapters like this, because it'll take one end and split it into 2, allowing me to require less cables. Okay, so now that we got a few risers in, I put 2 in and then a bunch of other cables. Since they kind of turn and almost fall, I'm going to start plugging in the graphics cards. Alright, so now that we got 2 GPUs in, I'm going to use these 2 as an example. We're going to want to basically power them. So as I explained, in my case, I'm going to be using adapters. So one adapter will go into PCI Express, and the other two ends will plug into the graphics cards to power them. So now with both GPUs in and powered up, I'm basically going to repeat the same steps that I just took of taking the little risers, plugging them into the motherboard, powering them, and plugging in a graphics card to this entire rig. That way we can fill it up. I'm going to basically time lapse it so I don't have to explain every single one. They're all the same.
Talk about quiet with a big mouth. Listen for the doubt, then call it. Make you out for what you say to me. Look at every single date. If you got what I need, then oh, I'll take you on like a big deal. Legs you can unfeel, key in ignition. Just keep me full like I had a meal once in a while. Feel alright. I know you like it, can't fight it. I might let you ride the wave.
Okay guys, so I added all of these graphics cards, which are powered by the two power supplies, total of 6, and I don't have enough power in these two, so what I had to do was I brought in this other rig just to hold 2 more power supplies, and I'm going to have it side by side inside of my tent, which is obviously what you guys know from TikTok, but it's just a nice easy way to hold these guys up in the same spot. So because I had this extra cage, that's what I'm using. Most of you, if you're not running this many cards, this one rig on a smaller cage will work with 2 power supplies. Okay, so this is it guys, this is a full build. There is a total of 10 GPUs powered by 4 power supplies. That's why I had to put the second rig up. So basically now I'm gonna put it inside the tent. I don't know how I'm gonna carry this myself because I have to carry both pieces at once, but I have to get it inside my tent, and then I will somehow do that, and then I'll be right back. Alright guys, so it's super loud in here. I'm trying to talk over this fan so you guys can hear me, but everything is inside this tent now. I'm going to open it up. It's going to be louder, so I'm not going to talk much. But yeah, basically the air inside this tent is being pulled in from there and from here, which is all cold air essentially because the AC vent is right there. And then it's blowing out these 2 vents outside, out the window. I just used duct tape to cover that whole window. It's an open window with literally duct tape. But it works incredibly. If I didn't have this, it would be extremely hot in here. And let's take a look.